Supply chain visibility is not control. The gap is now a liability. For years, visibility was the answer to supply chain risk. If you could see the problem, you could manage it. The data infrastructure built on that premise is now surfacing risks that organizations often have limited power to change, and regulators are not waiting for leverage to catch up with disclosure. There is a version of supply chain risk management that made a lot of sense for a long time. Build better visibility. Map your suppliers deeper. Get the data. Once you could see where the problems were, you could manage them. Companies spent the past decade building exactly that capability, and it worked. Shipments are trackable in real time. Supplier sustainability scores are available on dashboards. Emissions estimates run 3 and 4 tiers deep in ways that would have been impossible in 2015. The data is better than it has ever been. It is also revealing something uncomfortable. Visibility and control are not the same thing, and the gap between them is now showing up in regulatory exposure, assurance reviews, and commercial relationships in ways that are harder to manage than the original risk. What the Scope 3 numbers actually say about where companies stand. Start with the scale of the exposure. Supply chain, Scope 3 emissions run on average 26x greater than a company's direct operational emissions, according to CDP. EcoVadis's 2026 supply chain sustainability analysis puts Scope 3 at around 75% of a typical organization's total carbon footprint. Those figures have been cited enough that they no longer surprise anyone. What is less discussed is what the measurement picture looks like behind them. Only 38% of businesses are currently measuring their Scope 3 footprint at all, according to an IBM-commissioned survey. Of those, only 10% can do so accurately, per EcoVadis. Most of what gets submitted as Scope 3 data is spend-based estimates assembled in spreadsheets by supplier contacts who may not have GHG accounting training and are making educated guesses about which emissions factors apply. That data meets the technical floor of current reporting requirements. It does not hold up when an external assurance reviewer asks for the underlying source behind each category. Sphera's 2026 Scope 3 report found that 75% of respondents said regulation has accelerated their Scope 3 reporting, but 45% reported limited confidence in the data they are reporting. Speed is outrunning accuracy, and assurance reviewers are starting to close that gap on behalf of regulators. Seeing the risk and having leverage over it are two different situations. Here is where the visibility investment runs into its structural limit. Nearly 80% of buyers now have meaningful visibility into the sustainability performance of their Tier 1 suppliers. Only 12% have that level of visibility into Tier 2. The emissions, labor risk, and environmental exposure that actually move the needle on a company's footprint tend to sit further back than Tier 1, in the specialized manufacturers, critical mineral processors, and component suppliers where alternatives are scarce and purchasing leverage is thin. A company can map a supplier operating in a water-stressed region, understand the climate risk embedded in that facility, and know with reasonable certainty that the relationship carries long-term supply security exposure. Knowing it does not change the dependency. When a critical input comes from a small cluster of producers who supply the whole industry, the buyer's ability to impose environmental performance conditions runs directly into the same constraint that makes the supplier critical in the first place. The Sustain 2026 survey, cited by EcoVadis, found that 81% of procurement leaders say ESG factors matter in purchasing decisions, but 85% say actually finding sustainable suppliers is difficult. That gap is not a motivation problem. It is a market structure problem, and visibility alone does not solve it. Regulation is treating knowledge of a risk as the start of accountability for it. California's SB 253 requires companies with over $1 billion in annual revenue doing business in the state to report Scope 1 and 2 emissions beginning this year, with Scope 3 due in 2027. For companies remaining in scope, the EU's Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, CSRD, places significant weight on value chain emissions under the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, ESRS. Germany's Supply Chain Act is already in force. The EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, CSDDD, whose implementation timelines continue to evolve, extends further into environmental and human rights due diligence across supply chains. The legal direction across all of those frameworks is consistent, and it matters for how organizations think about what to do with their visibility data. A company that identified a supplier risk, engaged the supplier on it, and took documented steps to address or mitigate it is in a different legal position than a company that had the same data and filed it. Disclosure is becoming the floor, not the ceiling. What regulators and assurance providers are increasingly asking for is evidence that what was known influenced what was done. What procurement teams that are getting this right are actually doing. The organizations making real progress here are not necessarily the ones with the most sophisticated monitoring platforms. They are the ones that have built supplier relationships substantive enough to actually change behavior rather than just document it. Joint emissions measurement programs, shared planning on decarbonization timelines, operational support for smaller suppliers who lack internal GHG accounting resources tend to produce better data and better outcomes than audit cycles alone. Audits record the current state. They do not create the conditions for a different one. The other shift that distinguishes organizations moving forward from those that are stuck is where the visibility data goes inside the company. Supplier sustainability ratings that sit in a reporting system and do not feed into procurement decisions, category management reviews, or capital allocation conversations have not been acted on. They have been collected. The Sustainable Procurement Barometer found that top-performing organizations are 80% more likely to cite innovation as the primary return driver from sustainability programs, compared with 54% of others. The difference between those groups is not the quality of their data. It is whether the data connects to commercial decisions. Supply chain environmental accountability in 2026 is a harder problem than it looked when visibility was still the goal. Most organizations have built the data infrastructure. The next question, the one regulators are now asking formally, is what they did with it. You've been listening to Sustainability Soundbites by Environment and Energy Leader. For partnership opportunities, please reach out to our team.